Now, the US Secretary of State's on a fresh bid to woo European ministers in a last-minute effort to drum up support for a unilateral strike on Syria. This after the international chorus of voices against the move grew louder at the G20 summit in St. Petersburg. Even France, which earlier backed unconditional US action, now says it will wait for the results of the UN's probe into the alleged use of chemical weapons in Syria. The leaders of 10 countries did agree with Washington that some sort of action needs to be taken. The British Prime Minister also on the list, despite being rebuffed by his own parliament over a military intervention. Russia's call against a strike was strongly backed by 6 nations, including economic heavyweights China and India. But when it comes to the voice of the people, the US finds itself vastly outnumbered. World leaders opposing the war represent nations of more than 3 billion people, while the politicians in favour of a strike stand on the shoulders of less than 1 billion. Even in the US itself, the latest polls show most Americans are against intervention, while Congress remains split over the volatile issue. RT's Alexei Yaroshevsky has more on the outcome of the G20 summit.
Everyone is speculating who won this standoff, Putin or Obama, on the Syria issue. Indeed, I went through the press this morning and the majority have been saying that if Putin's initial plan was to disrupt Obama's plans of a military intervention into Syria, then indeed Putin has prevailed in that sense. We do know, of course, that there has been a lot of discord between the G20 countries on whether a military strike against Syria is needed, and clearly the biggest concern was whether Putin and Obama will have a meeting at all, because officially they had no meeting scheduled, something unprecedented for the presidents of the United States and Russia. But eventually, according to Vladimir Putin and Obama themselves, they met for a 20-30 minute friendly conversation, during which, of course, they discussed Syria. Indeed, Obama had high expectations of the summit coming here. He was hoping that he could persuade the countries of a need to attack Syria, that he could provide the substantial evidence of Bashar al-Assad using chemical weapons against the rebels. But clearly, judging by what the Russian president said on that matter, it seems that Obama failed on that sense.
I view everything that happened with the so-called use of chemical weapons in Syria as a provocation by the rebels who count on help from abroad, from those countries that originally supported them. That's the reason for this provocation. I also want to remind you that the use of force against a sovereign state is acceptable only if it's done for self-defense, and we know that Syria hasn't attacked the US, and only if the UN Security Council approves such action. As one of the participants of our discussions on the issue put it yesterday, those who do otherwise put themselves above the law.
Still, David Cameron, Barack Obama and François Hollande, the French president, they still try to play hardball, saying that the UN Security Council decision may be overruled if they believe that attack against Syria is needed. Well, to that, Russian president said that this may generate a great feeling of fear among smaller countries, obviously suggesting that bigger states may actually do whatever they want, overruling the mandate of the United Nations. So obviously now that the G20 summit is done, we're in for several very interesting weeks to see how the future of Syria will be resolved.
Well, let's get reaction now from political commentator John White, who joins us live. Mr. White, thank you for coming onto the programme. We've heard that John Kerry is in Europe at the moment trying to drum up international support. How big are his chances of forming a coalition of the willing, do you think?
Well, at this point, they look very, very distant. This is an increasingly desperate administration. And what we saw at the G20 was the end of an era. We saw the end of Washington's unipolarity. The world is no longer going to bend the knee to a US president, and it's no longer going to acquiesce to the writ of Washington, wherever it decides it must run. So this is the end of an era. John Kerry and the Obama administration in general is completely isolated in the court of world opinion, and increasingly isolated in the opinion of its own people, and according to the latest opinion polls, because people understand what is at stake with this. What we are talking about is the prospect of a US administration, a US government, entering into a military alliance with al-Qaeda in Syria. That's what we're talking about here. People understand that those are the stakes involved, and quite clearly they are appalled.
Well, this matter will go to vote in Congress probably next week. What are the chances, do you think, that they will vote in favour of intervention?
Well, it's going to be very interesting, isn't it? The momentous vote taken by the British Parliament last week has allowed anti-war sentiment to develop and incubate in the US and within the US Congress. The only thing I would say is because the ships have already been deployed, the aircraft are deployed, the plans are in place, no Congress, I think, will want to set a precedent whereby it boxes in a US president from taking military action. However, that said, the anti-war sentiment that is rising in the US amongst the American people is certainly being felt within Washington, and it's certainly been the catalyst for increasing voices of dissent within the US military itself. So this is going to be the defining week of the Obama presidency.
And do you think he has to listen to all that concern from the American people? Because the tone he is giving is that actually he doesn't have to listen to anyone.
Well, I think this again reflects his desperation. He's trying to appear strong whilst standing in quicksand, political quicksand. He is in reality between a rock and a hard place. If he receives congressional approval and goes ahead with this military strike, using that as a mandate, it will be a clear breach of international law. However, if he does not receive congressional approval and doesn't go ahead with this military strike, he will appear weak within the eyes of the hawks, within the US establishment and amongst his own people. So he is really between a rock and a hard place.
And do you think he will try to buy time by waiting for the results of the UN probe into whether chemical weapons were used?
Yes, this is clearly an attempt to create some breathing space so that he can persuade people within Washington, people who are hesitant to come on board, to get their support and to try and make the case within the America itself amongst his own people. I think he's going to address the country, the United States, on Tuesday, and this will be a last-ditch effort to alleviate concerns that there will be boots on the ground and so forth. But I don't think that boots on the ground is the basis of the concern within the United States. They're tired of a decade of endless wars, and they know the stakes involved in this particular situation, this issue. So we're talking about expanding a regional conflict, and we are talking about the United States government entering effectively into a military alliance with the same ideology responsible for the atrocity on 9/11, the 7/7 bomb in London, the Madrid bomb, and most recently the horrific murder of Lee Rigby in London.
And do you think the results of this UN probe will actually achieve anything? Because they're not actually trying to blame anyone, are they? And that seems to be the whole debate, who is to blame?
No, I think the UN investigation is tangential to the wider issue. The Obama administration, if you recall, was intent on taking military action last week before the findings of the UN team had actually been revealed. So the UN investigation, I think, is just embroidery. It's clear from the outset that the UN investigation will not be capable of attributing the provenance of the chemical weapons that were allegedly used, only that if they were used and what they were. But we do know from a prior UN investigation led by UN Special Investigator Carla Del Ponte in May that there was a strong likelihood that the rebels had sarin and had used it. This is based on her questioning of victims of that previous attack in Turkey. So this really does bear all the hallmarks of a setup, and it is propelling the United States towards a military political disaster. And what should not be forgotten, and the most important aspect to all this, is as we speak, the Syrian people are living with a gun to their heads in the shape of cruise missiles. They don't know if these missiles are going to be fired or not, and that's an awful thing to contemplate. This is a form of torture that the Syrian people are undergoing right now.
OK, thank you, Mr. White. We do have to leave it there. That's John White, a political commentator, live from Edinburgh. Thank you.
Personally, I am against military intervention. Firstly, it is a question of principle, because it is a little bit like surgery in medicine. An operation is the last solution, and when you're putting a knife into a wound, you don't know what is going to happen. So, it is first of all a question of principle. Then there is the question of opportunity. The Western governments now have a habit of ignoring international regulations and the ruling of the UN to make interventions everywhere and to apply what was called in the 19th century as gunboat diplomacy. A gunboat is a boat with guns. It is almost the same thing now, except that missiles have replaced the gunboat. I think we should not start the process. The fact that we need to intervene on the soil of a sovereign state, Syria, a member of the UN, declaring a war without a UN resolution. Where is international law? This means there is no international law. The most reasonable thing to do is to stop the conflict. We need to evaluate the military situation, which might be complicated to do, but the only way to stop the fighting is through dialogue. It is not by launching bombs. That will not stop the fighting. It will only intensify it.
Syrian government forces are now battling to clear al-Qaeda-linked rebels from the ancient Christian village of Malula. RT's Maria Fanoshina saw the operation gather pace in a remote mountainous zone that had been sheltered from the civil war until now.
Christian pilgrims from all over the world used to take this road to travel to one of their most significant shrines and one of the most holy places in Syria. Its residents still speak Aramaic, the language Jesus Christ is believed to have spoken. We too are driving to Ma'alula, but for another reason. On Wednesday, the central Syrian village, which had been among the few in Syria that didn't see any violence since the crisis here started in 2011, was attacked by rebel forces, most of them reportedly members of Jabhat al-Nusra. The war came here. After a car bomb exploded at a checkpoint, the militants of a radical Islamist group considered terrorists by the UN and US stormed in.
The army tells us that this is the closest point and we cannot go any further. We can see Ma'alula village from here, but the thing is that the militants who are still inside the village can see us as well. There are snipers inside the village, so it is really dangerous to go there. The soldiers say that the militants, mostly from Jabhat al-Nusra group, took over the mountaintop Safir Hotel, and from time to time they're firing from this strategic place. And there are also militants behind this mountain chain. The soldiers say up to 1,500 people. What is the situation right now in Ma'alula?
The militants, around 300 people, are hiding in Safir Hotel. There are ancient caves there under the village. They use them as well. They're watching us, and we are watching them. But if we start moving, they'll attack us.
The soldiers show me the militants' position. Armed Islamists who are behind a number of violent killings and are believed to be the most aggressive force confronting President Assad almost surrounded the Christian village. Where these people came from?
They came from the city of Homs in the north and from the city of Ain Fous in the south. This village is like an island in a storming ocean.
We visited Ma'alula last spring, a Christian island in a mostly Muslim ocean. The village was indeed unique.
We used to live in peace, Muslims and Christians. Of course we're afraid people from outside the city and the country may come and destroy this unity.
And it seems the residents' worst fears became a reality.
Why do you think the militants attacked this village?
They know that American missiles will not strike a UNESCO site, and the army will not dare hit it either. It's a safe haven for them.
While we talk, reinforcements arrive. The Syrian army plan an operation to clear Ma'alula from Jabhat al-Nusra rebels. There have been rumors that they have left the village, but the army say the militants are still there. And even if they leave Ma'alula, they can hide nearby and return.
How do you think the situation will change in case of American strike? Will the rebels, the militants from Jabhat al-Nusra, use this opportunity to advance further?
Of course they will. America is supporting terrorism in this country. We've been fighting with the US, in fact, for these 2.5 years. And now we can face them directly. But we are ready for that. We will not give up.
If America strikes, Syria's major military facilities will be targeted and destroyed. No one can say what the war on the ground will look like, but certainly this place will no longer look the same. Maria Fanoshina reporting from Syria.
And you can follow Maria on Twitter too, where she's keeping track of that mission in Ma'alula and giving regular updates on the developments in Syria.
No.